Okay, we're a bit over 7, so I think we'll probably start. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. So tonight you're here to hear about Synapses to Success, Understanding Neuroscience in Early Childhood. You've got myself today, Chris, and we've got Renata. So I come from a more biological background and involved in sort of neurobiology and nutrition and sleep and circadian rhythms and that kind of thing. Renata, you're more from an early years practice background.
Yeah, I work many years with children. I am a mum, and neuroscience is something that I'm extremely passionate about. How to use the neuroscience in the early years and all the kind of researches behind it. I love behavioral science, so when I can reach for any kind of new research, I get quite excited. So yeah. Very excited about tonight and a lot of other things that we have prepared for you, not today, but other days. So we want to bring more of a neuroscience to you because it is something that I think it's critical that everyone who works with the children should know, not necessarily the neuroscience, but what we can use from neuroscience in our own practice, whether we are child carers or we are parents.
Yeah, and so with that, we've obviously got a mixed audience. We've obviously been involved in neuroscience for a fair bit now, but not everyone might understand what we talk about in neuroscience. And quite often, when I speak to people and I mention neuroscience, they immediately think of brain surgery, and so neuroscience is a lot more than that. But let's just maybe cover the basics of what we're talking about here. So, what is neuroscience? Let's just cover that off so that we will understand what we're talking about. So where does it come from? The term neuroscience, we've got two parts. We've got neuro, which is nerve, and we've got sentient, which is knowledge. So really the knowledge of nerves, or put it another way, the study of a nervous system. And the nervous system, we can break it up into kind of two parts. So we've got the central nervous system, which is basically the spinal cord and the brain. And then we've got the peripheral nervous system, and that's all the nerves that spread out throughout the body. So those are the two kind of parts. However, the vast majority of the nerve cells or neurons, they're housed in the brain. So typically when we talk about neuroscience, really what we're talking about is the study of the brain. And within neuroscience, there's various different branches. So we've got things like molecular or cellular neuroscience. We've got the clinical side. So there's your brain surgery. We've got neurophysiology. But in terms of what we're talking about, we're focused more on the sort of developmental, cognitive, and behavioral side of neuroscience. Okay, so that hopefully gives you a kind of understanding of neuroscience, but as well as that, it's probably also worth to give you a kind of basics of the nervous system, so that when we're talking about neuroscience, you've got that kind of view of what the basic building blocks of the nervous system are. So let's do a kind of a quick 101 of the nervous system. So the fundamental building block of the nervous system is the neuron. So neuron or nerve cell. And here we've got a diagram on the left and a photograph on the right of a kind of a very typical neuron. Neurons come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. So typical is kind of a difficult word to say, but this is kind of just shows the typical kind of different structures of a neuron, which I'm not going to go into. But really what we want to get across is we've got these things, neurons, and their primary function is to send messages. So the whole nervous system is all about sending messages, and they go all over the body. So lots of messages are happening in the brain, obviously. The brain has lots of neurons. They also go down the spinal cord and out through the peripheral nervous system. And so we know when we pick something up, we are able to send a message for us to walk or sit down. We can breathe, we can talk, eat, walking and thinking, obviously, in the brain as well. It's all using this complex network of neurons. And there are essentially three different types. So we've got sensory neurons. Those are the ones that receive messages from our senses to then bring back those messages back to the brain. We've got motor neurons, which are basically sending messages from our brain to our muscles or organs for something to happen. And then we've got interneurons, which are the neurons that talk to other neurons. So again, the brain is filled with the interneuron type neuron. But a neuron on its own is going to be pretty useless because if it can transmit a message within itself, then that message isn't going to go very far. And what we have to have is neural connections. So as we talked about interneurons, we've got this way of connecting different neurons and transmitting that message. And this happens across what we call synapses. So synapses are neural connections. They're kind of, we talk about the same thing. It's a tiny gap between two neurons. So here's a diagram. I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but suffice to say that there's this gap. So we've got a presynaptic neuron, postsynaptic neuron. The presynaptic neuron will release chemicals that we call neurotransmitters. They will then traverse that tiny little gap and will attach to receptors in the postsynaptic neuron, and in that way that message continues down the chain, so it passes from one neuron to another. In terms of the number of connections we have, it's probably worth saying that with the number of neurons we have, the best most recent estimate is that we've got 86 billion neurons in our head. So a pretty vast number. Whenever we talk about numbers in biology at this kind of level, it's sometimes quite difficult to comprehend, but 86 billion, 86,000 million neurons all packed in our head. So if you think that's a big number, let's talk about neural connections. Every neuron will have anywhere from a few connections, a few synapses, to hundreds of thousands. And so when we're talking about number of synapses and number of neural connections in our brain, we're well into the trillions there. So really huge numbers there. And I'm just going to touch on this diagram. This is a Purkinje cell, which is a specialized type of neuron in the cerebellum. Cerebellum is that the primary function there is around movement. And you can see there this intricate layer of all these sort of what we call dendrites. They're the kind of like little extensions away from the nerve cell body. And each one of those will attach to some other connection, some other neuron. So thousands of connections there in a Purkinje cell.
I think what would be good to explain what actually synapses mean in the real life, how that transfer in kind of everyday life. So do you have any example?
Well, I think we're going to move on to that shortly, but in terms of whenever we're experiencing anything, the way we kind of take in that information and make sense of it is by creating these synapses, creating connections. So, for instance, if a child with a spoon, if an adult, as an adult, all adults, if you pick up a spoon, you know what a spoon is, you know what to do with it. If you quiz a child about a spoon or give a child a spoon that has never had a spoon before, they'll probably start creating all these different synapses because if it's metal, if it's plastic, if it's long, if it's heavy, yeah, how big is it? And then if they use it to put in their mouth, what kind of feeling is it? So all these different synapses will be created because all these experiences are brand new. These synapses are being created, and throughout all those experiences, the ones that we do on a repeated basis, those ones will start to strengthen, and the ones that we might maybe experienced occasionally but don't experience again, they'll get weakened and they'll get removed after a while if we don't encounter them again. But I think we're gonna move on to that shortly. So if we talk about, so we know now what neuroscience is, we understand the basics of the nervous system. How does that help us in terms of early years practice? And this is one of the things that we want to get across. So the early years are really important in terms of all of this brain development. So we know that the brain starts to develop soon after conception. Around about 13 weeks is when the first semblances of the brain and the central nervous system start to develop, and it continues to form that brain over the whole gestation period. So by the time we're born, we have a fully functioning brain with all those 86 billion neurons already created. However, we don't have that many connections yet. So we know that from when we're born, it's a very formative period of time, and however the child develops, however we help the child develop, that's going to have a lasting impact throughout their whole life. So I've talked about those synapses having many, many connections, and we've talked about the kind of experiences creating those connections. So we've got millions of connections forming in those first few years. In the early stages, sort of soon after birth, we kind of peak around 1 million connections every second. So there, again, another huge number, difficult to comprehend, but 1 million connections every second. So there, after I've just been talking 15 seconds, so I said that's 15 million new connections. So loads and loads of connections happening. And that's basically, as a newborn, within the womb, you're kind of shielded from the outside world, and the experiences you have are quite limited, especially relative to after birth. And suddenly you're exposed to our living world, our environment, and everything is new. You're taking everything in. So all these connections are starting to create and manifest themselves. And so we've got this huge proliferation of all these connections. But at that moment, that sort of, and probably in the first 2 years, that's when the number of synapses kind of peaks at about 2 years. We're just experiencing everything and want to remember everything and store everything. But not everything is relevant, and some things are more relevant than others. And so this is where we start having to kind of tone down our, or how to say it, we're going to specialize our synapses to our actual environment and realize what's important and what's less important. And what this is basically what we're talking about is brain plasticity. So in those early years, our brain is very plastic. It's able to mold itself really easily. And so this diagram, I think, is quite nice because it shows 2 lines there. The blue line is the brain's ability to change in response to experiences, and the orange line is how much effort there is for those changes. So you can see in the first couple of years, that blue line is way up top. So really easy to change, and the amount of effort is pretty low. And that blue line falls off quite sharply and continues to fall away as we get older. And again, the orange line is pretty low throughout childhood and then starts to rise as we get older as well. So you can see the plasticity of our brain is really high in those early years, and it becomes less plastic as we get older. It doesn't completely diminish, and that's a good thing. So we are able to continue to learn and adapt as we age. And obviously that's important because we don't live in a world that doesn't change. It changes all the time. So we are able to keep, as long as we've got the will, we can continue learning until we pass away. Okay, and one more thing about the plasticity and the connections and the forming of the brain is there are kind of three foundational stages of brain formation in those early years that they happen sequentially. So the first thing that the brain forming focuses on is those sensory pathways. So the ability to understand our sensory receptors and what senses are telling us. vision and hearing are two key examples. They're pretty big in this. And so lots of synaptic activity happening there to understand and be able to kind of decipher the senses, the sensory information that's coming through. So that's happening in the first few months. Then we've got language capabilities come after that. Now, obviously, we need to have a good development of our vision and hearing pathways for us to be able to start to develop language. The language, as I said, comes next. And then once we've got those two pathways already developed, we then can do higher cognitive function development. So those three are kind of key steps in that kind of formation of the brain.
Okay, and why the brain development is so important? We mentioned that a little bit earlier, but kind of long term, when we're looking at what we want from our children, that we care for, or our own, it's them becoming well-functioning adults, and that means being able to have a good executive functioning. And what that means is being able to plan, really use that cerebral cortex rather than, react with impulses, not being able to self-control themselves. We want them to be able to make decisions, have a good working memory, being flexible. And what we know from the research is that I assume you're all working with small children. We know that children from the age of 0 to 3, they usually work on impulses. They're not really thinking about what they're going to do and how they're going to do. But from the age of 3, sometimes a little bit later, because as we know, again, children are unique. They develop at different pace. Some neurodivergent children it might take a little bit longer to develop the self-regulation skills. But it is from the age 3 and 7 when those self-regulation skills start taking place. And we know that children who have those skills a little bit higher, they have a higher executive functioning, also language skills. Also, when they become adults, we know that they have better things like self-worth, which is obviously really extremely important when you are an adult. They have they're much better able to deal with stress. They're much more resilient. When they struggle with some kind of issues in life, like we all do, they are much better on picking up and brushing themselves off and carry on. So it's so important those first few years in a child life that we help them to develop those executive functional skills, and help them to self-regulate.
Yeah, and you mentioned the positives of going through that appropriate development and the self-regulation, but equally on the negative side, children who don't develop in an optimal way, and aren't able to self-regulate, they're more likely to use substances or abuse substances, more likely to go into law breaking, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's really important these early years for kind of well-functioning adults, as it says, their optimal physical, mental well-being. This stuff is really.
And there's a huge evidence of people who are in prison that they didn't get that love and nurturing and safe environment in those few first years. So I think the numbers are like 90% of them. So it's huge numbers there. So much more should be done for children in our early years. So yeah.
And in terms of self-regulation, if we're talking about self-regulation, it's useful to just talk about the limbic system. So we're back in the brain again. The limbic system is this kind of older part of the brain. So it's in the kind of what we call the midbrain. So some of the key areas of the brain that are part of the limbic system, we've got the hypothalamus, amygdala, and hippocampus there. So they make up what we call limbic system. It's more of a kind of a logical grouping of some of those areas that all lead to the same kind of function. Now, the limbic system is more of our kind of instinctive side. So it evolved a long time ago. It evolved before the kind of prefrontal cortex evolution. So what made us kind of higher cognitive functioning species. So it's there and it responds to stressful situations. It's more instinctive, it's more reactive. And so when we look at, for instance, a toddler's brain, where that cortex, as we saw the cortex and the cognitive functioning, that only starts to develop later on in those early years. In a toddler, the limbic brain will still already be well developed, but where the cortex is still developing. So young children, they'll have less ability to rationally deal with their emotions, and I'm sure anybody working with toddlers will have experienced something like that.
So self-regulation. So the way, I don't know if you know Dr. Shankar, very big name in the self-regulation industry. So he describes self-regulation as the manner in which a child recovers from the expenditure of energy required to deal with stressor in their daily environment. So if you saw the temper tantrum, that's energy, that's a surge of adrenaline, cortisol, that, kind of flows into the child's nervous system, and that's why there is usually big outbursts and big tantrum and big scream and shouts. So one of the good things is that YFS, Early Years Framework, has now acknowledged the importance of self-regulation, and they describe, they look at the child development, and they describe self-regulation as to for a child to be able to show an understanding of their own feelings and those of others, and begin to regulate their behavior accordingly. So they also are able to work towards simple goals, being able to wait for what they want and control their immediate impulses when appropriate. They also are able to give focus and attention when the teacher says, responding appropriately even when engaged in activity, and show ability to follow instruction involving several ideas or action. Again, every child is unique. Some of them, it might take a little bit longer. Some of them, can show quite a high level of emotional intelligence very early on.
And self-regulation is not, self-control is not another word for self-regulation, is it?
No. Self-control is very different. You can, for example, when you're really angry, you have a very big day, and someone walks in and is being not very nice to you. You have to control. You're going to still be nice. I don't know, the client or whatever. You're still going to be polite, but inside you kind of like, really, that's self-control. Self-regulation is taking perhaps time out, get that, the kind of calmness in your body. So helping yourself to, okay, I'm going to have a cup of tea, or I'm going to go for a walk, or I'm going to, have a hot or cold shower, whatever works for you. But you're able to self-regulate, to calm yourself down, that you get into that kind of homeostatic state when you calm and relax and all is fine. Sometimes it can take short time. Sometimes, obviously, we can go through days when something terrible happens to us, but we still try to self-regulate. We still try to calm ourselves down, because we don't want to be in that state. It's not good. That's what we would be calling toxic stress. It's not good for us. So it's important to be able to kind of help ourselves to get ourselves into that calm state. And everything works for everyone different. So it's important to find and explore what works for us.
Mm. But yeah, so if we get angry, or if we get sad or scared, it's our ability to deal with that emotion and get back to, as you say, that homeostatic point that we're back to normal.
Yeah. And when it comes to children, we often talk about co-regulation. So we're helping child to co-regulate. Here we go. But it's also, as adults, with a social species, we need other people for connection. And unfortunately, we're living in a times now when we're all very connected, but we're really kind of disconnecting when it comes kind of really the closeness, the close relationship where we can be ourselves. We usually friends from our childhood, they are the kind of, they know us, they know our life and things like that, so they can be really good. Or sometimes you meet a person and you just click on and you kind of feel that they really get you. And we need those people around ourselves to help us to get through the life. And unfortunately, now we're living in a busy towns, we go to work and do all those kind of things. And sometimes we forget about how we need to nurture those relationships, because they really, really important for those moments where we need someone else to co-regulate. And we need it probably more often than we actually think we need. It's just that system, that environment we live in. So co-regulation, so adults coaching, teaching children how to deal with their emotion and how to regulate their reactions to them. And emotion coaching is one of the ways that adults can help children to understand and deal with their emotions and stress. We're talking here about cognitive kind of how we, or kind of emotional way, how we can help children, but we probably can also talk about modeling, right? Modeling how we are, dealing with our emotions, showing our children how we taking care of ourselves, taking to time, talking about our emotions and saying, this was really scary, but now, I've done it. I'm so glad I've done it. I was really scared. That can be very empowering of the children, because being stressed, being angry, being frightened are normal emotions. There's nothing wrong with them, but being able to deal with them, that's what is really empowering. So it's really important for us to speak around the children in a kind of suitable way, obviously, depending on their age, temperaments and sensitivities. You probably know most of the people who are working with the children are very sensitive, very attuned to the children, so you know what you can say. But modeling the children your own self-regulation or co-regulation skills is really, really important. So yeah, that's about the co-regulation.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for that. So we've talked about stresses and stresses that children encounter along those last few slides, but it might be worth just talking about stresses in a bit more detail. So when we talk about stress, what we're talking about a state of mental or emotional strain caused by adverse circumstances. Now, stress can be acute, episodic, and chronic. But even before we go into those three categories, stress can be positive as well as negative. Most people think stress is negative, and I guess on the whole it is negative. But we do have positive stresses. So, for instance, winning a football match or getting a good result, anything that makes us excited, or if you think about any situation where you suddenly your heart rate's increasing and you're feeling that kind of adrenaline rush, whether it's something negative or positive, that they both affect they affect your stress system and create a stress response. So just worth bearing in mind that they can be positive as well. But as I said, we've got acute, episodic, and chronic. So acute would be something that happens and then it's like a one-off. So, for instance, winning a football match or having a car crash, it happens and we move on. It doesn't happen again. So that's kind of acute. It's a one-time thing. What we have about acute episodic is those kind of things that happen on a kind of individual basis, but they do repeat, and so that's where we term acute episodic. And then chronic can be an extension of the episodic, where they sufficiently repeated without any kind of support from others, and it becomes overwhelming. Or chronic is something from a really kind of difficult situation, and I'll give you some examples in a minute. But if we just look at the acute episodic, the kind of examples there, so pain, injury, something that happens, we deal with it. Maybe friendship issues, so that might be episodic. So you might have an instance of that, it might repeat. Changing school, moving house, the divorce or separation of parents, again, that's maybe not just a you might deal with it, it happens, and you move on, or it might carry on with further episodes because it's quite a drawn out kind of thing. And similarly with transitions at nursery and school, some might be acute, some might be episodic. The way the chronic differs, so here you've got some really good examples. Being a young carer, so there's something that unfortunately does happen to some people, and it's quite a big burden, and so that can manifest itself as chronic stress. Bullying as well, so you could see bullying as an acute episodic stress, but without the appropriate support, bullying can become a chronic stress. Homelessness as well, a really difficult situation, family money problems, unsafe home or neighborhood, that can have a big impact, especially on children, and the big one is abuse or neglect. So that's very commonly manifests itself as chronic stress.
Can I just add?
Yeah.
Have you finished?
There you go.
Yeah, I just recently read a study. It's from an organization called CASA in USA, and it really surprised me, and it will make you realize how we might think that, children 0 to 1, they're small, they don't remember, the memory starts, the part of the brain where stores the memory starts from develops age 2, 3. So that's generally the first memories we have. So the study was done on the children on different ages who were dealing with who were experiencing domestic violence, not necessarily dealing with domestic violence on them, but in a household. And basically what the study said, what really surprised me, it was from the various ages, I don't know, up to maybe 14 years of age. There was 0 to 1, 1 to 2, and so on. And it was actually the biggest impact, domestic violence on children was on children 0 to 1. And that makes you think those children don't remember much. And yet it has such an important and critical influence on their, development.
And that goes back to the neural connections and all the synapses.
Yeah. So I just wanted to mention that because that kind of surprised me as well.
Yeah. And one other thing about the stress, so especially when we talk about chronic stress, so it can have, well, if we go about normal stress, so we have a system in ourselves to deal with stress because that's how we've evolved, way back when we were hunter-gatherers or whatever, meeting a saber-toothed tiger or anything that will have a stress response. We'll be able to either fight it or run away. That's all part of our evolution. When we look at chronic stress, so what I'm saying is, having a stress response is a good thing. But when we have chronic stress, that can go in kind of two ways. So if you imagine you're constantly at this kind of heightened stress, or lots of things are building up to your stress, you can get hypersensitized to stressful events. And the smallest thing can raise you above your kind of sanity threshold in terms of how much stress you can cope with. So you're potentially always living just a fraction below this kind of threshold of being tipped over. So it's a very dangerous sort of place to be in terms of being hypersensitive to any little stress. Or on the flip side, with chronic stress, you can actually get desensitized to stress, and so it becomes more of a kind of depressant, and so you experiences that you have, they simply don't register so much, and you have a desensitized life, really. So either way, they're kind of bad, where normally you should have a healthy positive or healthy stress response that you have a response and then you recover from it, and again, self-regulation helps with that. So okay, and we talked about emotional coaching as well. So I think, Renata, you're going to just run through briefly what we talk about. Emotional coaching obviously is a course in itself, but I think you're going to just
we're going to talk about this emotion coaching simple step. There are a few other kind of frameworks, but we're going to be talking about this one that we call it STAR. So step one, we recognize and empathize with the child's feeling. We validate and label their feeling. Then we set limits if needed on behavior, and then problem solve. So in the first step, we stop and recognize. That's S4, what I said, STAR. I think we should have put acronym here, but that's okay. So we should really always stop and kind of think about how that child makes us feel, and especially the people who maybe came from the household or had a childhood where perhaps the parents were not as emotionally attuned to them, and maybe they were a bit, couldn't kind of cope with emotions, of high emotions of their children. You probably, many of you recognize it. Or don't cry, stop crying. Parents couldn't cope with the children's stress, and they wanted to stop, so they react quite harshly. So it's really, really important to kind of acknowledge how it makes us feel. And very often, and I love work of Philippa Perry. I don't know if you know her. She's a psychologist, therapist. She has a brilliant book. If you had a childhood that wasn't perhaps as kind of, the parents didn't have the understanding of emotions, I would really recommend you read it. It's called, The Book You Wish Your Parents Had Read. She actually wrote another book last year called Book You Want Everyone Who Loves You to read. And it's all about how our childhood as a past are influencing our emotions. And she's got a few TED Talks as well. So going back to this stop is to really kind of think what's going on in the child's moment, right? Very often we look at the behavior, but very often is not the behavior. There is some kind of trigger, there is some kind of emotion. There is usually the stressor. Most often there is a stress. Either child is tired, they had a long day at school, they might be hungry, a lot of those things might happening, and sometimes a lot of them at the same time. So they're going to be, trigger, and we need to really kind of try to empathize and kind of feel what's going on, and try to calm down, because there's the thing, when we trigger, they trigger, then it's not going to get anywhere. And if we can, as much as is possible, kind of put ourselves in a child's shoes, trying to empathize with them and attune. I don't know if you understand the word attunement, but it's that feeling. It's almost like a dance when we kind of connect with that person and we kind of really feel where they are. I recently went on I'm going to talk about it a bit later because I think that's more relevant. So the next one from the acronym STAR is word think. So it's about kind of label and validate what is happening. Sorry.
Yeah, the STAR is about step one. I think you've confused your acronyms. So STAR is stop, think, attune, and reflect. That's step one.
Oh yes, stop, think, attune, and reflect. And step two is a label and validate. Sorry, yes, you're right. Sorry, I'm getting all confused. It's a bit late, and I started to talk and got very excited about Philippa Perry. So I'm sorry about that. So yeah, so it's using the words and reflect upon their experience and validate it. So things like, I can see that you're really angry when that happens. I would be angry too. It's okay to feel that way. I notice you're looking to others working on their project. I wonder if you're feeling nervous, I see that you're really struggling with the math, and that kind of showing them that you kind of understand where they come from. And I also wanted to mention, recently I went to Paul Hughes. He's very well-known psychotherapist with children who came from very, very, very difficult background, and he on the training he showed us this video of how he attuned to the children who basically didn't want to speak to him. They basically rejected. They didn't trust any adults. All the adults in their life let them down, and he needed to find some kind of connection with them. And the way he did it, it was very clever. So he attuned to their emotions in the way that to meet their emotions. So when the child said, oh, I don't want to speak to you, or leave me alone, stop it, I don't want to hear it. So he would try to come on the same level, in the same kind of tone of voice as they were, and try to understand what they were saying. So he would say, yeah, I understand. I wouldn't want to be here. It's so nice outside. If I was 10, I would like to be playing. And he kind of got that attention. And it was brilliant to see how those children who refused to talk to many, many adults, because, as I said, they were let down, were not interested, were really closed off, were able to connect with him just because he was able to match them on their level of emotion. So that was really interesting. So this can be quite helpful for when you've got older children and they kind of get a bit too emotional, too verbal, that you can kind of get their attention and kind of attune to them with a similar level of emotions they kind of experience.
And I think also speaks to validating the feeling. So you're basically more than just empathizing with them. You're saying it's okay to have that feeling that you're having. So validating it, yeah.
You validate, and it's that attunement. There is also words. There is also kind of connection before correction. So even if they've done something wrong, you can tell them what they've done wrong, but they're not going to listen to you until they feel you connected, right? So it's always the kind of connection through emotions can work really well. Not always possible, right? So everyone who works with the children, we can have a beautiful theories, and every child is different, every situation is different, but we have to try. We can have some tools in our pocket and hope they're going to work, and sometimes they will work, but not always. So anyway, the setting limits, obviously that can only come when there is that connection. So we can talk to the children. I very often spoke to my children, sometimes few hours, maybe a day, or maybe a few days later, and kept kind of coming back with the same theme, when that happened and that's how you reacted and what you have done. Do you think you could have done something else? But also, if there was something serious, you can say, what you have done was wrong. This is not acceptable. So it's important to have those boundaries and say it, but it's very difficult to do it when the child doesn't listen. Yeah. So, and a step 4 is the problem solve. So again, going back, what has been done, what we could have done about it, how we could have coped, maybe giving them alternatives. Children find themselves in a situation where they've never been before. They might be surprised how they reacted, So giving them the kind of scaffolding, giving them ideas what could be done and how be done, and empower them and believe in them, they can overcome it, and not be too disappointed when they fail, because we have to try again. We have to build up those synapses. So it's again repetition. So yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you for watching our video. For more London School of Childcare Studies content, see our social media or visit our website childcarestudies.co.uk.